Welcome to the Actual Fluency Podcast with Chris Broholm. This show will inspire, motivate, and teach you how to learn foreign languages the best way. On this show, you'll hear incredible stories from amazing language learners who've learned 5 to 10, even 30 plus languages, as well as industry experts who help shape modern language learning through innovation and research. As we dive into language learning methods, techniques, and apps, you'll quickly discover what works and what doesn't. This is the Actual Fluency Podcast, and this is Chris Broholm.
This episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast is brought to you by Optilingo. You can learn over 18 languages with the guided immersion method. For your free lesson, just go to optilingo.com. That's optilingo.com. Hey guys, how are you doing today? This is Chris, and this is episode 170 of the Actual Fluency Podcast. I'm really excited to be back with new episodes here of the podcast. Thank you so much for the many messages, texts, and emails that I received about the new episodes, and also many of you listened to last week's little teaser episode where I was going looking ahead for this year's Polyglot plans, and also a few of the Actual Fluency features coming up and new episodes. So thank you for that. And today we're back with a good old-fashioned episode with Mark Pentleton. He is the founder of Coffee Break Languages, which is a series of podcasts where you can learn various languages to various levels as well. Some of the languages they have from complete beginner to advanced, with various ways of engaging with the materials. From podcasts, of course, their main strength, but they also have different formats. They also recorded some videos lately. They're quite active on YouTube, so definitely check them out. And they're a really nice company. I had the fortune of going up to Glasgow to meet Mark in the office and meet the team, and I even got to record this episode that you're about to hear now in the Coffee Break booth. So me and Mark get into a little bit of that in the beginning of the episode, so I won't talk too much about it. But I just want to say I really enjoyed this episode with Mark, where we talk about his language learning passion. Mark is a real languophile, if you can call him that, and speaks a handful of languages really well. And he went from being a language teacher to a language podcaster. And Coffee Break Languages serve something like 2.5 million language lessons a month via the podcasting format. So we get into a little bit of that in the episode, how he kind of transitioned from a teacher to a podcaster, and everything in between. We also get to talk a little bit of Scandinavian, the middle bit of Danish. I try not to do too much of that, but Mark is really interested in Scandinavian languages, and although I tease him a little bit for bringing out Coffee Break Swedish before Danish, and I think his Swedish is better than his Danish, he does speak Danish quite well, and he's got a good grasp of the accent. So I'm excited to see his improvement as well, and speak some Danish with him next time I meet. And I think that's pretty much it. The last message I just want to share with you is, if you have anyone you would like to hear from on the podcast, this series for this year, please do send me an email. I'm happy to invite anyone onto the show who has an interesting language learning story, or maybe they've learned 20 languages, or they have a unique method, or they went to a country and assimilated quickly, or whatever the story may be. We're always happy to hear language learning stories here on the Actual Fluency Podcast. And I guess one final anecdote, since it's been a while since I've recorded an episode. I hope you forgive me for this extended intro. I met Mark the first time in Berlin in the Polyglot Gathering, and I think it was 2014, the very first one. And I had only released a couple of episodes of the podcast, or maybe it was the second year. But in either case, I remember talking to Mark, and here was a really professional podcaster. At that time, Coffee Break Languages had been going on for something like maybe 8 years or something like that. I think he founded it about 2006. And so he was already a very professional podcaster. The company was already doing really well. And I was this kid on the blog trying to do a podcast. And if you guys have listened with me from the beginning, you'll know that some of the earlier episodes were, let's say, a little bit varying in quality in terms of the audio quality, but also obviously my skills as an interviewer. Even my accent was different. Yeah, when I go back to the old episodes, I can't even recognize myself anymore. But I mean, that's part of development. But I just remember Mark giving some very, very nice feedback, but in a very sort of let's just say, you have a lot to learn, kid, but you have a good starting point. So I'm really grateful to Mark for being an idol to me, definitely in the podcasting sense, but also in the business sense, in the language sense. And I'm really happy to consider him a friend, and I had the fortune to hang out with him a lot last year, and I hope that continues. So thank you to Mark for being on the show and being an amazing person. Let's dive right into it. Okay, perfect. Well, we're here. We're live from Radiolingua headquarters in Scotland. Well, live, I guess, delayed live anyway. But I wanted to give the listener just a little background to what's happening right now, because this is quite unique. This is the first episode of the Actual Fluency podcast that's been recorded professionally, if I may say so. So Mark Pentleton is my guest today. Welcome to the show, Mark.
I'm delighted to be here.
Obviously, founder of Radiolingua. You might know the company behind the Coffee Break series. But Mark, can you describe just what it looks like right now if somebody were to look at us?
Well, we're in a little box that's about probably 7 feet by about 4 feet, and it's covered in blue tiles. We've got 2 windows so that we can actually see out. But yeah, this is our recording booth that we use for all our Coffee Break podcasts, and we're delighted to have a special guest here today in the shape of Chris. So yeah, that's
fantastic. And, I might come back and do all the Actual Fluency episodes in here.
Okay, you'll need to schedule that.
Okay, yeah, we'll figure it out. It's a little hot here, but hopefully it doesn't get too bad during the summer.
I should say we do have a thermometer in here. We're currently sitting at 24 degrees. Our record so far is 32.4.
Wow.
So hopefully we won't get to 32.4.
Where's the oxygen supply monitor? Is it okay?
Yeah, we do have a filter and an air conditioning unit, but the problem is it's noisy.
It's
so
too
we can't,
noisy. Yeah.
We can't put it on.
You can't get the quality. But anyway, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the Actual Fluency podcast and taking the time with me today. So the first question, as you probably have heard as a listener, is what's your background in languages? How did you first get interested in it? Do you remember anything as a child growing up hearing foreign languages?
Yeah. Well, first of all, my grandmother was Italian. So we did have a little bit of Italian at home. We didn't speak Italian all the time at home, but my grandmother would tell me to close the door and come here and all those kind of instructions and so on in Italian. And I loved trying it out, and I loved trying to say a few words. But I guess my earliest memory of learning a language was sitting in my other grandmother's house with my big sister, who was she'd just started doing French as she started secondary school, and so she was learning the words for le crayon, le stylo, and all the kind of classroom objects and so on. And she was teaching me these words, and I thought, this is amazing, because there's other words for these things that we know, an English word for. And I think that's probably my earliest memory of being involved in some way in learning a language. I would have been maybe 6 then, or 7 or something like that.
And when did you have any foreign languages in school, in elementary school, primary school?
Not in primary school at all back
wow.
then. So it was when I went to secondary school before I first started learning French. And at that stage, I did French for 5 years at secondary school. And later on in secondary, I picked up Italian, and I did a kind of crash course in Italian, which was helped by the fact that we had a little bit of Italian in the family. But I guess my Italian was more sort of formally learned than naturally learned around me.
Right. And how did you choose a degree based on that, or your further studies?
Yep, I went on to study French and Italian, and then swapped to Hispanic studies. So I did French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese at university, and I absolutely loved it. And I'm a combination of language and literature and culture and so on. So that's kind of where I really sort of got more deeply into the language. I also did a night class in Norwegian at the time,
wow.
which proved to be very useful later in life. It was just I went along on a Tuesday night or something like that to learn a little bit of Norwegian.
I tried one of those for Italian. It's an interesting experience being in a night class because it really takes some extra motivation to get going.
Yeah, definitely.
So the people who are there, they're quite keen, I find, compared to normal school where, everyone's mandated to be there. So it's kind of hard to get the motivation.
Yeah, definitely. But I enjoyed it. I think one of my, I don't know whether this is a problem or it's a good thing, but one of the issues I had was I was wanting to go much faster than the class was going, because I would get the book and then work through the book. So I would be, I don't want to say more advanced than the other learners there, but I was definitely motivated to learn. But I found perhaps the people in the class were going along to the class. They maybe didn't have time to do any more than that. So I guess the teacher at the time, I think, wanted me to stop asking questions, basically, so that she could teach to everyone rather than answer my questions. I was probably a bad pupil.
Maybe. But, or a really good one.
Well, I guess there's two ways of looking at it.
Yeah, the balance, I guess, is a little bit off. But so you're a professional, I guess you're a professional language teacher at that point.
Yeah.
So you get a job in teaching languages to others at that point when you're done.
Exactly. Yeah. So I finished my degree at Glasgow University, and then I did teacher training and became a teacher in a secondary school in the south side of Glasgow, which I absolutely adored. I loved teaching in a school. I thought it was just the most wonderful opportunity to share my passion about language learning with young people. I taught French and Spanish there for 4 years and absolutely loved it. At that point, I got an opportunity to run a kind of special project about languages for a wider group of schools. And so I took this opportunity in the year 2000 and started running the Partners in Excellence project, which was basically a virtual centre for modern languages, where we worked with 29 secondary schools across the west of Scotland. Some were very large urban schools, some were very rural, very small schools. And the idea there was helping the young people involved in the project to understand that a language was not just, if you like, a subject that they do in school. A language is a living thing. It's something that young people just like them use every day to watch TV, to tell jokes, to argue with their parents, to fall in love with each other, and so on. So it's a living thing, and that was what we were trying to do with that project, to take language learning out of the classroom and give them opportunities to use the language in different contexts.
Did you find any resistance from the students in language class? I mean, second tier students are notoriously kind of, let's say, resisting a lot of the education that they're receiving. So for language studies, did you find that a lot of the pupils were saying, what do we need this for? What's the point? I'm not living in Spain.
Yeah. I think we, in the UK in general, we suffer from the fact that English is our first language, and that is the language that ultimately the rest of the world seems to want to learn. And we suffer as a result because young people aren't perhaps surrounded by the language that they're learning in school. So I would imagine in Denmark, you would be surrounded by English and you would have lots of English music, English films, English TV programs, and so on.
Absolutely, yeah.
But for my students, when I was teaching, they were not surrounded by French pop songs and French music and films and so on. So it is more difficult for them to see the value in it. But I think when they start to see the language as not a school subject and as a living thing and something that can bring reward, that's when they click. That's when the sort of relationship with the language changes, and they suddenly realise, actually, this is not just like chemistry or woodwork or whatever it is. It's not just a school subject. It's something else.
Yeah, that's been my biggest criticism of school language learning anyway. From the very beginning of actual fluency, I was writing about how language learning in schools is really bad, but not because the teachers, it's not because the students often, it's mostly because the subject is being treated exactly like maths or physics, where you're supposed to learn a lot of facts and then being able to recite those facts.
Yeah, so, I would have to say that there are two sort of influences there that are important to recognise. One is that when it comes to learning facts and so on, then it's very often the exam that is determining that, and therefore teachers perhaps feel the need to teach to the exam, because ultimately pupils have got to get through that exam.
Absolutely.
That's what everything's based on. The other area is where the management of a school is not understanding what a language is.
Yeah.
And therefore they're just trying to, again, I've been in situations where teachers have said, well, it's okay, we'll just put the Spanish students and the French students in the same class. They're all doing language. And that is just absolutely ridiculous, because you can't necessarily deliver the language in that sense. But I think teachers are doing an absolutely brilliant job across the country.
Yeah.
And they are very often struggling against this idea of having to teach to an exam, or having management who are not perhaps supporting language education in the way they could.
Absolutely. I think often I've had some fantastic language teachers over the years, and I've heard a lot of stories of people who have had great language teachers that inspired them to do more languages after they were done with school even. Mm-hmm. But again and again, it's just the system that's not built for the real world, really. It's like, here's all the conjugations of a verb, even though one of the conjugations you'll only use 1 out of 1,000 sentences. Yeah. It's like, why did I spend mental capacity in the beginning of learning German to know that form? Yeah. And even if you say the wrong form, you'll still be understood in many languages. So it's like, indeed. It's a total waste of time. But I mean, we're obviously not here to do a socio-critical episode of our language study. I think everyone understands, at least listening to this podcast, that learning a language is ultimately your own responsibility. And you can get a lot of help along the way from teachers, and you can get a lot of help from podcasts like Coffee Break, or you can get some inspiration and motivation from this podcast. But it has to come from you. And I think translating that, it has to come from the student as well when you were in school teaching. But apart from that, I really like the enthusiasm of language teachers. I think it's quite unique from the other subjects what I experienced anyway. It's always subjective, You hear some people who have terrible language teachers, of course, that happens. But in general, I think the teachers are not the problem. It's the system. It's the centralization, the exams, and
I think also one of the other problems is in some cases when young people are learning or taking their first steps in learning that language, very often it's also right at the time when they least want to be speaking out, they least want to embarrass themselves in front of their peers, and yet they're expected to be talking about things in a foreign language, and sometimes based on the situation or based on what has to be covered, they're talking about things that they wouldn't talk about in English. Like, what do you have in your bedroom? And we've moved on from that. Certainly in language teaching, we've definitely moved on from that, and thank goodness. But it's difficult to see the motivation, or it's difficult to maintain that motivation for the young people, especially when they also are hearing that, you've got young Danes who are speaking amazing English, and how can they compare themselves with them? But it's not a level playing field. It's not the same scenario, because again, we're at a disadvantage not being surrounded by French or Spanish or Italian or Danish or whatever.
Yeah, and it's like it's your biggest gift, but it's also your biggest kind of weakness for the English-speaking world, because obviously speaking English gives you unprecedented opportunity across the world. Like, for instance, you could become an English teacher in China tomorrow, probably. They need so many people, and they'll probably pay for your flights, your apartment, and everything. So that's a good thing. But it's right that it's kind of like it's a self-contained world very often, because the logic is, well, everyone else speaks English. Why do I need to learn a second language? Yeah. But I think we're seeing some positive developments in that area, and I think people are starting to understand that it's not about being understood necessarily. It's not just communications. It's actually enriching people's lives.
Yeah, definitely.
Your own and the recipient of the language. And I'd like the mental exercise as well.
This is the Actual Fluency Podcast with Chris Broholm. Make sure to join the Actual Fluency email club by going to actualfluency.com/join. We'll be right back after these messages.
A big shout out to Optilingo for sponsoring the Actual Fluency podcast here in 2020. Optilingo is a language learning app that features a method known as guided immersion to teach you over 18 languages at the time of recording this segment. And it focuses a lot about speaking and repeating and listening, of course, to get your pronunciation just right. It doesn't bother about grammar, it doesn't bother about long explanations of syntax or morphology or any kind of complicated concepts that kind of hold you back from speaking better. And you can get a free lesson right now if you go to optilingo.com. That's OPTILINGO.com, Optilingo. And if you do decide to subscribe for the full version of each language, like I said, there are more than 18 actually available. It's only $5 a month, so it's extremely affordable as well for the full package. But I'm just really happy they are part of the podcast here in 2020, and it's run by my good friend Jonty, who kind of stumbled upon the method that the app teaches when he was trying to learn his own heritage language of Circassian, of which there is not a lot of resources out there for. So thank you so much to Jonty and Optilingo. I hope you give it a try. And let's get back to the action.
You're listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast. And now, back to Chris.
All right, we're back here with Radiolingua founder Mark Pentleton. Mark, we've been listening a little bit to the educational side of things before, and I really wanted to get into learning a little bit more about Mark, obviously the founder of Radiolingua, I want to know about, but also if we can contrast maybe some of your teaching and school learning experience from university to how you would do it today. Yep. That would be great. So I don't know which one you think we want to jump into right now.
Well, here at Coffee Break, I guess what we feel is we specialise in teaching languages to people who perhaps don't consider themselves as language learners. So obviously our beginners courses, our season 1 courses of Coffee Break French, Spanish, German, Italian and Mandarin, and I think by the time this goes out, Swedish too, they are for absolute beginners, people who perhaps have never come across the language before. So when we are teaching in these courses, we very much focus on helping people understand not just how to say a particular phrase, but why that phrase is the way it is. So we don't shy away from, in a sense, the more complex aspects of the language, but we teach that in a very friendly and a very approachable way. I'm thinking as an example, for example, if we're looking at ordering a coffee in German, and right from the very beginning of the first task that you do in German, ordering a coffee, you have to think about the fact that a coffee is ein Kaffee, but you can't just say ein Kaffee bitte, because there is an idea there that you need the einen Kaffee because of the case and so on. So even at that very early stage, you do have to recognise some of the complexities of the language. But we feel that we specialise in making those complexities very approachable and very understandable for the learner. So that has made us think about the way in which we teach, the way in which also we use the format, because ultimately we're talking about podcasts here. Our base content is in a podcast format. So the podcast format allows us to spend as long as we need to cover particular areas, so cover particular topics or particular grammar points or whatever it may be. And we can leave space for the listener to think. We can leave space for the listener to come up with their answer and things like that, which I guess if you're making CDs or something like that in the past, you wouldn't be able to do, because you've got you've got 54 minutes that you need to fill in that CD. Whereas in creating a podcast, we can do that just as long as we need to.
Yeah, it's a great format, and a lot of people are commuting, of course. So that, in my opinion, that it's like time travel in a way, because you add learning onto an existing activity. So that's like adding hours in the day.
Absolutely.
So it's a great format for that. And I know I've heard from a lot of listeners who are, in America and find themselves in very, very bad traffic, like in LA. So shout out to my commuter friends out there. It's not as bad as it looks when you can have a good podcast in your ears. But let's go back to the beginning of the company. When did you first think about, I want to do something more with my language hobby or passion, as you're teaching professionally, of course?
At the time, we were coming to the end of the project that I mentioned. So the Partners in Excellence project, the funding was running out from the Scottish Government. So I was going to be working on projects in education, but not language related. So I kind of thought, I still want to be involved in language teaching. And at that stage, this was 2005, and podcasting was very much just in the early stages. We had done some podcasting within the project. So we had a project podcast. So all the students that were involved in this project were listening to the podcast. But this was in very early days. This was pre-iPhone and pre-iTunes and so on.
Yeah.
So
it was on iPods that came out first, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. iPod, I think, was 2001.
They put podcasts on the iPod at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So we were experimenting with podcasts in my day job, as it were. So I basically spent some of my own money on getting microphones and so on, and thought I want to start a Spanish podcast. And it so happened that a colleague's daughter wanted to learn Spanish, and therefore we decided to start Coffee Break Spanish. And at that stage, it was very much a project to keep my mind involved in language teaching. And we thought, right, we'll put these podcasts out there. Maybe someone will listen to them. And lots of people listened to them. And we suddenly realized, well, actually, this is something that could be really successful. At the time, when iTunes launched, we were pretty much, we were the first beginners Spanish podcast on iTunes. And of course, iTunes has now become Apple Podcasts and all that. But right back then in 2006, when we launched Coffee Break Spanish, it was the first beginners podcast for Spanish on iTunes. And as a result, we were lucky in the sense that we got in early, we got a lot of exposure, and that meant that lots of people were finding Coffee Break Spanish.
Fantastic. And obviously Spanish, really popular language in the world. I mean, there's the second most learned language in the world, something like that.
Yeah.
So obviously getting in there is fantastic. But I'm sure at the time it was a hobby. Turning into a kind of a fully fledged company and dream must have been amazing at the time.
Yeah, I mean, way back then, I was still working full time in a day job, as many people have done, made that transition from day job to part time, and then I went full time on Coffee Break. And I think at that point, we first of all started to think, well, maybe we could produce some show notes, and the show notes might sell. We could charge $1 for the show notes or something like that, and that's what we did. And then people suddenly started buying, and I thought, "Whoa, this definitely could be something bigger." And over time, gradually, we've built that. We've added Coffee Break French in 2008, and then onwards from there, we added German and Italian and Chinese and now Swedish.
And you sped up the process as you got more resources, got more experience.
Exactly, yeah. I think the process is still a slow one. We don't churn out these courses. They're carefully thought out, they're carefully prepared, they are not just random lessons in a series. So it's all very much designed in the best way for the learner. But we've also added more advanced courses. So with French, for example, we've got 4 main seasons or 40-lesson courses. We've got shorter courses like the En route course. We've got the Coffee Break French magazine, the Verb Fix, and all these different sort of ancillary products that go along with our main courses. And we have just started working on Coffee Break French Season 5, which is a huge project. It's all based around a story, and we're developing that story out, and it's a very, very high level of French. And so the same goes for the other languages. We gradually build them, and obviously the more recent languages have got fewer courses. But with Spanish, we've got quite a number of courses, and then we're building with Italian and German as well. It's
coming, all the editions. But you say 40 hours of 40 episodes.
40 episodes
for a season.
Yep.
So how long, just complete estimate, would you take from conception to final edit of the 40 episodes, just to give people an idea of the scale involved?
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, with Swedish, which we're doing just now, and this is having learned lots and lots and lots over the past 13 years. So with Swedish, we started the process of creating the content, writing the content and writing the outline and so on back in sort of July this year. We've now had maybe 3 or 4 recording sessions, and by the end of next week, we'll have recorded up to the lesson 10. So there is a lot that goes into the design of the course and the editing of afterwards and so on. But what we also do, in addition to the podcast, we produce free podcasts, obviously, and they go out on everywhere where you can get podcasts. But we also create a course that goes along with that. So we've got video versions of the lessons with the words on screen. We've got lesson notes. We've got the bonus audio materials as well. And so all of these are recorded and made at the same time. Therefore, from pretty much conception to release, it can be a year and a half, something like that. So it's not something, we get emails every day saying, can you make a coffee break Gaelic? Can you make a coffee break Japanese, a Turkish or whatever? And I think maybe listeners sometimes don't fully understand the depth that is involving. It's not just a case of getting someone who speaks one language and someone who speaks English into a room and making a podcast.
Right. And also, you're very much part of all the podcasts so far.
Yep, so far.
And so obviously you running a company, but also being the voice of the episodes.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I love teaching. I love being involved in the teaching process. And I think if I wasn't involved in that teaching process, then I would perhaps enjoy my my work less. And when it comes to the teaching, again, for me, it's not necessarily about teaching in a didactic sense. It's about sharing that love for learning and learning the language and about the culture and so on. So, for example, in the French and the Spanish and the Italian courses, I have a teaching role. But in the German course, I've got a learning role because my German's not quite so good. And likewise in the Chinese and in the Swedish, I'm the learner. And yeah, it means that I'm involved in everything, but I also have an overview of how every course that we've ever done has worked. And therefore I know how to kind of control, I guess is the word, and to help the teacher in these courses make what sounds like a coffee break course.
Yeah. And I also think that for listeners, especially people who are interested in multiple languages, having that familiar voice brings back some kind of, it makes it easier to stay on track because it's not just a new random Italian voice or a new random. So I think that might be an extra benefit that you didn't mention, just to have that central topic. And I've seen a lot of the comments, I learned French from a Scottish guy, it's some great comments out there, and they all love you for being part of all the episodes, I'm sure.
A couple of comments referring to Shrek and things like that.
Right.
I've learned Spanish from Shrek in the swamp.
I'm sure lovingly submitted. But
I think the other thing is that as a learner of, yes, okay, I'm the teacher on Coffee Break French, but I'm still a learner of French. Every time we do a French podcast, I learn something new. And I think mirroring that learning process and helping listeners to, I guess in a sense, lead, if I'm leading their learning, that they are discovering it along with me. And if Pierre Benoit teaches us some cool expression, then, I can get enthusiastic about that, and then listeners in turn will get enthusiastic. And possibly the fact that although, yes, I am not a native speaker of French or Spanish or Italian, that I'm quite confident in my French and Spanish and Italian, and therefore that also perhaps gives the learner listening the idea that they will also be able to achieve that high level of language as a learner.
Yeah, and I think you also have a better position to understand the struggle.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of people saying, "Oh, I want a native speaker." A native speaking teacher.
Yep.
And I think for some parts like pronunciation, it can be very helpful. But for general learning, I would say that the non-native but quite really good teacher has a lot of advantages because they know what it takes to get through the struggles.
Yeah.
Whereas a native speaker would just say, well, that's just how it is. So that really is a good concept as well.
Precis.
Yeah. And how is apart from podcasts, what do you use yourself to improve your languages and maybe add new ones if you ever have the time? I mean, you have so much to do.
I've always got one on the go. I've always got a language on the go, to be honest. And it's really, I mean, I've heard lots of people describe this kind of process as sort of being like a magpie or something like that. You flip from one to the other, and there are other less polite terms as well. But I think for the languages that I want to learn, I honestly would love to have our Coffee Break magazine, for example, level of content where I'm listening to interesting texts I'm getting lots of input, and I'm understanding those texts with the help of a teacher explaining the different parts of those texts. I find that when you're listening to, if I'm listening to, for example, I've recently been listening to a lot of Swedish news. So I listen to the news in easy Swedish or something like that from SVT or something like that. I'm not quite sure. Radio Sweden. And when I listen to that, it's fantastic because I'm getting authentic pronunciation. It's read slowly, so I'm understanding bits of it. But what I really, really want is for a teacher to go through that afterwards and say, okay, did you hear that word? Listen to that word again, and then we're going to put it into a different context, and let's use it that way and get that kind of content. And so what I feel we're doing as a company is creating the kind of content that I would want to learn with
right.
if I didn't speak that language already, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Having said that, I also really like books.
Right.
I'm quite a traditionalist when it comes to, picking up a colloquial Swedish or what I'm doing at the moment is using a Langenscheidt German course to learn Swedish because it's got some interesting texts in it, and I like doing that, sort of learning one language through the other.
Yeah, that's a great one. But what better way to run a language company than with your own vision and that other people like as well? I mean, that's win-win-win, isn't it?
Well, theoretically, yeah. I get to do what I like to do. And with a team, we've got a fantastic team here, and the team very much buy into this idea because they've seen the comments from the learners. We use Slack as a communication method all the time, and we've got a channel in Slack. We call it Customer Love. And basically any time anyone posts a nice review or a comment or a Facebook review or sends in as an email, we put that in there, and every single member of the team sees that. So they see the comments that are coming in. And we also put in comments that are constructive, so we can all benefit from that too. But I think that's really important that when we are working with our team, that the team understand that learners are finding what we do useful, and therefore we want to do more of it.
Yeah, and how has the methodology changed over the years? Like from the first coffee break season to the one you're doing now, the fifth French one?
I'm told that my accent has changed.
Your accent?
my Scottish accent,
right?
My English accent. I'm told that, and actually when I listen back to some of the earlier Coffee Break French and Spanish episodes, I was a wee bit more chuchtery, a wee bit more Scottish. But my son, my two sons often comment, "Oh, he's got his podcast voice on," whenever we're abroad or whatever, and I'm speaking in correct English and trying to speak clearly. Oh, he's got his podcast
voice. Yeah.
So I guess in one sense, maybe my diction has changed.
Oh, wow.
But in terms of the learning, I think we're still, when we create a new course, like what we're doing in Swedish at the moment, is reflecting what we did in French and Spanish, 13 years ago. Obviously, what has changed over time is our systems and the way in which we're producing the content. We've got a more streamlined system. We've got a team that can, take a recording and then work with it and then bring the video content together and then create social content around that and so on. So we've got all of that now. But the actual learning process and the teaching content that we're using, we kind of feel people enjoy, and therefore we don't want to change what's not broken, as it were.
Yeah, the pedagogy. What do you call it?
The pedagogy.
The pedagogy. Yeah, it's a strange word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pedagogik in Danish.
Yeah. Danish.
So it's.
Vi kan på dansk.
Yeah, I mean, people think that's a loan word from Danish, but I think it comes from Greek.
I think it's Greek.
But whatever, we'll take it, I guess. So, how do you make the decision of which languages to add? Is that
a tricky question?
Which language Mark wants to add to his repertoire next? Or
No. It's not all about me. I think it's a combination of things. First of all, it's about people. I think when you're running a small company, everyone needs to be part of the same team. You need to have people that I don't want to say fit, but that buy into the way in which you're creating content. And so what we've found over the years as we've developed our team, we've got people who who are perfect for that. And as we add new languages, it's when we meet the right person to work with on a particular language who gets where we're coming from, who gets where the customer, who the learner is coming from, and who understands what we are trying to achieve. Yes, we have some plans in terms of which language to look at next. We've got some... there's some challenges in terms of which language to do. First of all, because of the other stuff that's out there. So there's some amazing content out there for certain languages.
Yeah.
There are other languages which are a little bit less well served. And in a sense, that's where our Swedish has come from, because we feel that it's not necessarily about doing the big languages, if you like. And when you do a smaller language, then what you'll find is that you've got a group of learners who are absolutely passionate about learning that language, and they are almost their enthusiasm counts twice for that language in comparison to a language where there's lots of content available and lots of learners learning that. The Swedish is a little bit of a personal passion. I've always loved all things Scandinavian. We just chose to go with Swedish first. Sorry, Denmark.
It's all right. We can build the course How to Learn Danish from Swedish afterwards.
Okay.
It's be a very short course, but I always thought that could be interesting to do.
Yeah.
Or vice versa, really.
Yeah.
Because there are obviously some patterns, and there's some... The core vocabulary, just for anyone listening, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are 99% the same.
Yeah.
But the pronunciation is obviously quite different. But not different that you get very confused after being there for a while. Yeah. You'll get used to it. But, well, some people say you never get used to the Danish pronunciation. But,
I wasn't going to say that.
just putting out there. But there are some key words here and there that are different. And I think if you do a frequency list and then taking out all the duplicates, that would be a great way to start.
I mean, I think as we've been doing our Coffee Break Swedish, and I have done a little bit of Norwegian in the past, and it's so fascinating to see how things are a little bit different, but those differences are quite important.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'll keep saying things to Hanna, our Swedish teacher, I mean, on a very basic level. Jeg heter Mark på norsk, in Norwegian. Jag heter Mark på svenska.
Yeah.
Och på dansk.
Jag heter.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But written down, obviously, we're
it's very similar, yeah. But some people hear L's there, which I, as a Danish ear, I can't hear at all. But when I say hiller, people are like, that sounds like you're saying hella.
Yeah.
But no, it's D, it's double D, which is a very tricky one in Danish.
And you've got your R's and your L's and your D's they all kind of sound quite similar in some ways in certain dialects.
Yeah.
I read yesterday
Danish
for the first time about Waffle Day in Sweden,
right?
Which apparently comes from Vår fru dagen.
Right.
Which then, in certain dialects, became Varfrudagen or something like that, and it then developed into Vaffeldagen. So Waffle Day
surprised.
Started out as Our Lady's Day.
Yeah.
Blows me away.
Yeah, but the Scandinavian culture is receiving a lot of interest now. So if anyone listening, it's a great time to learn the languages now.
Absolutely.
You've got... In the UK, for instance, everyone's really obsessed about Hyuga. This coziness in Denmark. It does exist in Sweden as well, but they usually refer to it as their version is something like fika. It's like which is coffee break.
Coffee break, yeah.
Yeah,
I might have mentioned once or twice in our courses.
Well, but I guess you could have called it fika Swedish, because that's kind of like the
branding doesn't work.
No, probably not. But in the UK are obsessed about Scandinavian, and it's cool to see. And it's a bit weird as a Scandinavian because you don't really put much notice at your own culture.
Yeah.
But obviously, there's a huge selection there, and the food is great as well. I think, for instance, bread, like there's just as an expat, speaking, is like, where can I get good bread in the UK? It's like they don't do it at all. It's like you can get 50 different kinds of toast, but any dark bread, no, not possible. So if anyone listening is interested in Scandinavian, I definitely encourage it because everything else ignored, you also get 3 languages for the price of one.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's always good to do. But yeah, the Danish language is interesting. I think it's probably the odd one out, really, because Norwegian and Swedish, they're so similar. They don't even need to translate or anything. Mm-hmm. But if a Danish person meets any of them abroad, they would typically speak in English.
Yeah.
Which saddened me a bit. I did some work in a call center in the UK when I first came here. And we had a Swedish department, a Norwegian department, and a Danish department. And I was shocked to see that everyone was speaking English to each other. And I said, come on, guys. I mean, how long will it take us to understand each other's little dialects, little variations, to be able to just communicate? And it didn't take long.
Yeah. It reminds me of the TV show Brun.
Yeah.
And I remember watching that and absolutely being so relieved when the Swedish part was happening because I understood what was happening. Well, with the subtitles, obviously, but I could recognize what those Swedish words were being used when I was watching the English subtitles. But in the Danish parts, this is it's a TV show which is a crime show set on the bridge between Malmö and Copenhagen, basically. So it's a TV series that involves both Swedish and Danish police inspectors.
The crime happens like in mutual jurisdiction or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when the characters in the Danish side were speaking, I found it much more difficult than when the Swedish characters were speaking, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's tricky. And as I've done a little bit of Danish teaching before, and it's really hard to teach the pronunciation because it's almost like it's not pronunciation. It's almost like redacting.
Yeah.
Like you're taking away things rather than adding things. And it's really hard to teach. And what I find is that people generally, if they have no experience with Scandinavian languages, is they typically overdo it.
Yeah.
And that's funny because normally people underperform pronunciation. But I generally find with Danish that people they sound ridiculous.
Tell me, how do you say your second name in proper Danish?
Well, Broholm.
Broholm.
That's a big problem. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent if we have, a few minutes.
I've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, great. Because I live in the UK, and every time somebody asks me for my name, I have no idea how to say it in a way so they understand the letters.
Right.
I don't care if it's authentic. I don't care if it sounds like the Danish. I just want people to understand it starts with a B, and there might be an M at the end.
Yeah, okay.
But no matter what I say, nobody ever gets it. So that is a bit of an issue, first world problems there. But
if it's any consolation, people can't write Pentleton either correctly, so don't worry too much.
No, I don't.
Broholm, I guess is
Broholm.
But
Broholm.
Broholm.
Yeah.
Broholm. Yeah. Broholm.
Yeah, it's an unusual name actually. Most Danish names end in en, like sen, sen, for son of, which is not the real son of, just for people who might not know. For instance, in Russian, you have the patronym, where you get your father's name. But in Danish, it's not. It's an ancestral name.
Yeah.
So even though your name might be son of Jens, your dad might be Peter.
Yeah.
It's completely. It's not used. I think Iceland is more traditional like that as well. Yeah. But most names in Danish has that ending sen. So not having that is quite unusual. Uh-huh. So that also stands out a bit. But I do have a castle somewhere in Denmark.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah,
quite a famous one.
We know where the next polyglot gathering could be.
Yeah. No, but that could be fun to go over there and shoot some Danish videos in the Broholm castle. Yeah. But yeah, so I guess my kind of conclusion is definitely learn the Scandinavian languages.
Absolutely.
They're fun. You get like 3 for the price of 1. And very, very, very different cultures as well. So Denmark is completely flat. Like we don't have any hills or anything. You go to the top of Norway, you've got proper mountains. Yeah. And that changes a lot of things, not at least the weather. And I know there's basically no sunlight in the northern Norway for like half the year. Yeah. So that changes things and food and culture and tradition.
Dialect.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the funny thing about Norway. People think that Danish is strange. you should try and hear some of these really northern dialects. You just think, is this even Norwegian?
The frustrating thing is that no one actually speaks the Norwegian that you learn in books, right. Because that's a kind of, there are two versions of it, Bokmål and Nynorsk, and they are amalgamations of different dialects. Well, certainly Nynorsk is, but it's fascinating.
It's like really modern standard Arabic or BBC English.
Exactly.
Nobody really speaks like that.
But I think one thing that's really important about Scandinavian languages is that because you all speak amazing English, the minute someone speaks to you in the Danish or the Swedish or the Norwegian that they've learned, it completely changes the relationship.
Yeah.
If I'm making an effort to speak in Norwegian or Swedish, I wouldn't really make the effort to speak in Danish because you would just laugh. But it does change the relationship because I don't need to.
Yeah.
You speak amazing English, and maybe it's tricky because it's difficult to get someone to speak to you in Swedish or Danish or Norwegian.
It is,
But at the same time, it does change that relationship. I found that in Norway particularly.
Yeah, I think Scandinavian countries are very notoriously bad for responding in English when somebody tries to speak to them in the country or in the language. But I think if you know a little bit about the culture, is that people are very reserved. They're very kind of inward looking. And one way to kind of pass through that outer shell is definitely to, if you're good at the language, you don't need to be an expert or anything, but if you can do that, you definitely communicate at a different level. Whereas English is more like just a formality, you get the information across, but you don't build a relationship. So, but anyway, we're looking forward to Coffee Break Swedish coming soon.
Yep. And
Coffee Break Norwegian.
Who knows what
Coffee
next?
Break Danish. Never know. But thank you so much for being on the Actual Fluency podcast, Mark.
It's been a pleasure.
And more importantly, thank you for letting us record here in the Radiolingo headquarters, the Coffee Break headquarters in Glasgow. Beautiful rainy day.
On a rainy day, yeah. We couldn't sort the weather for you today, I'm afraid.
That's a shame. But thank you so much, Mark. And if people want to know more about Radiolingo and the Coffee Break series, can you tell them just where to go?
Absolutely. If you just head to coffeebreaklanguages.com, you'll find everything that you need to there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that.
Thanks for that. This episode was brought to you by Optilingo. Learn over 18 languages through guided immersion by going to www.optilingo.com. That's OPTILINGO.com.
Thanks for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast with Chris Broholm. To get more language learning tips, strategies, and inspiration, join the Actual Fluency email club by going to actualfluency.com/join. We hope you enjoyed the show and hope you've gotten some useful information. Till next time, this is the Actual Fluency Podcast, signing off.